The fundamental premise always revealed, more or less distinctly, in the revolutionary mentality is the total opposite. The truths it professes are historicism and empiricism. According to the revolutionary mentality, becoming rules in the spiritual realm as well. Everything is believed to be conditioned and shaped by the age and by the times. According to the revolutionary mentality, there are no principles, systems, and norms with values independent from the period in which they have assumed a historical form, on the basis of contingent and very human aspects such as physical, social, economic, and irrational factors. According to the most extreme and up-to-date trajectory of this deviant mindset, the truly determining factor of every structure and of what resembles an autonomous value is the contingency proper to the various forms and development of the means of production, according to its consequences and social repercussions. In Chapter 7, I will discuss at greater length the historicist thesis I have merely outlined here, in order to clarify the fundamental and unbridgeable gap between the two premises. It is therefore useless to engage in a discussion when this gap is not acknowledged as given, a priori. The two views are irreconcilable as the patterns of thought behind them. The former is the truth upheld by the revolutionary conservative, and by any group that, in the political realm, can be properly characterized as part of an authentic right. The latter is the myth upheld by world subversion, the common background of all its forms, no matter how extreme, moderate, or watered down they may be. The previous considerations concerning the method and the meaning of some historical references also have a practical value. As a matter of fact, in a nation there is not always a sufficient living traditional continuity, whereas referring to existing or relatively young institutions may serve directly as a reference to the corresponding ideas. Conversely, it may happen that, when the continuity is broken, the previous procedure is adopted. Then one must look to other eras, but only in order to derive from them ideas that are valid per se. This is especially the case for Italy. In previous books of mine, I have often wondered what could actually be preserved in this country. In Italy, we find no basis of political forms that have been preserved sufficiently intact from a traditional past. This is due mainly to the fact that such a past is lacking, and that, unlike in major European states, in Italy there was no secular and continuous unitary formation connected to a symbol and to a central dynastic political power. More specifically, in Italy, there is no trace of a strong ideological legacy, not even as the legacy of a few, that would enable people to feel everything connected with the ideologies that arose with the French Revolution as extraneous, unnatural, and destructive. In fact, it was precisely these ideologies in various forms that propitiated the unification of Italy, continued to prevail in a unified Italy, and multiplied in the most virulent forms after the fascist era. Thus, there is a hiatus and a vacuum. In the case of Italy, the reference to traditional principles will necessarily have an ideal rather than a historical character. And even if we refer to historical forms, we should only acknowledge them to be the mere basis for an integration that will immediately leave them behind, having in mind ideas instead, the historical distance being, as in the case of the ancient Roman world or certain aspects of medieval civilization, too great for that reference to serve any other purpose. Such a circumstance does not represent a disadvantage from all points of view. For instance, if the ideas to which I allude were implemented by a new movement, they would appear in an almost pure state, with only a minimum of historical dross. Unfortunately, Italian representatives of these principles will not be able to benefit from what some states, especially the Central European ones, displayed as a residual historical positive basis or as a predisposition for a conservative revolution. The positive counterpart of this disadvantage is that if the formation I have in mind will come into existence, it will be endowed with an absolute and uncompromising character. Precisely because there is no material support still alive emanating from a traditional past and made concrete in historical forms that are still valid, the conservative revolution in Italy must emerge as a predominantly spiritual phenomenon based on a pure idea. However, since that present world looks more and more like a world of ruins, sooner or later the same line of action will assert itself everywhere. In other words, people will realize that it is useless to lean on what still has vestiges of more normal institutions, but which is compromised by several negative historical factors, and that it is imperative to go back to the origins and to start anew from them, as if they towered over history, moving ahead with pure forces along the path of an avenging and reconstructive reaction. It may be useful to make another brief consideration of the term revolution applied in a particular context, namely in relation to the fact that in various national right-wing movements opposed to the present system, we find a yearning to be revolutionary. This tendency, after all, was present in the movements of the most recent past, considering the choice of designations such as fascist revolution, or revolution of the brown shirts, and revolution of order, e.g. Salazar's movement in Portugal. Naturally, one should ask, revolution against what? Revolution in the name of what? In any event, every word has its soul, and one should be careful not to be unconsciously influenced by it. I have made it clear from my perspective that one could speak of revolution only in a relative sense, as Hegel used to say, a negation of the negation, in reference either to an attack against something that has a negative character or to a number of changes, whether violent or not, aimed at reinstating normalcy, just as a person who has fallen down gets up again, or an organism is freed from degenerative growths by halting the spread of cancerous cells. Thus, it is necessary to prevent the hidden soul of the term revolution from influencing even those who are not leftists, leading them away from the right course when they claim to be revolutionaries, in a sense that diverges from the one I have just indicated, in virtue of being somehow positive. The danger may consist in appropriating, more or less implicitly, foundational premises that are not different from those of one's opponents, espousing the idea that history marches on, and that it is necessary to be open to the future by creating new things and formulating new principles. In that case, the revolution becomes an aspect of a forward direction, a course that would then imply breaking points and upheavals. There are some who believe that in this fashion the revolutionary spirit acquires a greater dignity and as a myth exercises a greater power of suggestion. I believe this amounts to a capitulation. It is then difficult, even without being aware of it consciously, not to espouse the progressive ideology according to which every new thing represents something more and better than what preceded it. We already know what the true foundation of progressivism is: the mirage of technological civilization, the lure exercised by some undeniable material and industrial progress that, however, is appreciated without paying much attention to its negative drawbacks, which often affect other, more important and valuable domains of human life. Those who are not subject to the predominant materialism of our times, upon recognizing the only context in which it is legitimate to speak of progress, will be on guard against any orientation in which the modern myth of progress is reflected. In ancient times, the matter was very clear. In Latin, the word denoting subversion was not revolutio, which had a different meaning, as I have explained before, but rather seditio, or eversio, or civilus perturbatio, or rerum publicarum commutatio. Thus, the term revolutionary, in its modern meaning, was rendered with circumlocutions such as rerum novarum studiosus, or fautor, namely one who aims at and promotes new things. According to the traditional Roman mentality, new things were automatically regarded as negative and subversive. Thus, in regard to revolutionary ambitions, it is necessary to clear the misunderstanding and to choose between the two aforementioned opposing positions, which determine two likewise opposing styles. Again, on the one hand, there are those who acknowledge the existence of immutable principles for every true order and who abide by them, not allowing themselves to be swept along by events. Such people do not believe in history and in progress as mysterious superordained entities, but instead attempt to dominate the forces of the environment and lead them back to higher, stable forms. According to them, this is what embracing reality amounts to. On the other hand, there are those who, having been born yesterday, have nothing in the past, who believe only in the future and who are committed to a groundless, empirical, and improvised action, deluding themselves that they are able to direct events without knowing or acknowledging anything that rises above the plane of matter and contingency. Such people devise many systems, the end result of which will never be an authentic order, but instead a more or less manageable disorder. The revolutionary vocation belongs to this second line of thought, even when it does not directly serve the interests of an unadulterated subversion. In this context, the lack of principles is supplied with the myth of the future, through which some dare to justify and sanctify recent destructions that have occurred, since in their view they were necessary in order to move ahead and to achieve new and better horizons, any trace of which, I am afraid, it is difficult to point out. Once things are clearly seen in these terms, it is necessary to thoroughly examine one's revolutionary ambitions, all the while aware that if these ambitions are kept within their legitimate limits, one would then be a part of history's demolition squad. Those who are still standing upright in this world of ruins are at a higher level. Their watchword is tradition, according to the dynamic aspect I have just made evident. When circumstances change, when crises occur, when new factors come into play, where the previous dams begin to crack, these people know how to retain their sang-froid and are capable of letting go of what needs to be abandoned in order that what is truly essential may not be compromised. These people know how to move on, upholding in an impassive way the forms that are proper to the new circumstances, knowing how to assert themselves through them. Their goal is to reestablish and maintain an immaterial continuity and avoid a groundless and adventurous course of action. This is the method of the true dominators of history, which is very different from and more virile than that of the merely revolutionary. I will end this series of considerations with a particular application for them. Since I have said Italy lacks an authentic traditional past, there are some who, in their attempt to organize themselves against the avant-garde of world subversion, and in order to claim some concrete and historical basis, have found a reference point in the principles and institutions of the fascist era. I wish to uphold the following fundamental principle. If the fascist ideas still deserve to be defended, they should not be defended simply insofar as they are fascist, but rather insofar as they have represented a particular form of the apparition and affirmation of ideas that were older and more elevated than fascism, ideas that have the character of constants, so that they may be found again as integral parts of a great European political tradition. To cherish these ideas not according to this spirit, but solely because they are revolutionary, original, and proper only to fascism, would amount to belittling them, adopting a limiting perspective, and making difficult a much-needed task of clarification. To those for whom everything begins and ends with fascism, including those whose political horizons are confined by the mere polemics between fascism and anti-fascism, and who have no other reference point besides these two poles, these people would hardly be able to distinguish the best potential of the Italian world of the past from some of its aspects that were affected by the same evils that it is necessary to fight against today. Thus, when I will later discuss ideas for which the Italy and Germany of yesterday fought, I will always do so within revolutionary traditional parameters. I will take the utmost care to limit as much as possible any contingent reference to the past, and to emphasize the principle's pure ideal and normative character, which is not connected to a particular period or movement.